Hundreds of people in the valley say they are hearing voices in their heads. And those voices are being transmitted by microwave or other methods.
Well, several viewers asked us to investigate what they call electronic harassment. KMIR6's Angela Monroe joins us now with what she's discovered. Angela.
Electronic harassment, synthetic telepathy, voice-to-skull technology. Chances are you haven't heard of these terms, but after searching the internet, I found dozens of websites dedicated to the phenomenon and several Valley residents who say they're victims.
How much more can you invade me than to go into my brain?
It sounds like somebody else is reading the book, only it's thoughts.
We're not having a group hallucination. This is actually something that's happening.
These men all live in the area, didn't know each other before the voices started, and say someone is playing mind games with them.
Mostly it's a lot of derogatory comments about whatever you're thinking about.
Only time I ever had a whole sentence, he said, "This is not about you," which just frosted me. If it's not about me, what the hell am I going through all this for?
Kevin Bond says he used to have a normal life.
I was living in the San Diego area. I was clerking for a federal judge, and I noticed that I was being followed by a whole bunch of people.
According to the websites, what Bond is describing is called gangstalking. He moved to Palm Springs to escape.
I started hearing, as you'll hear, hearing voices and what they'll call voice to skull or microwave hearing.
Bob Stansfield says his experience was similar and started a decade ago.
They were active in following me around here, and I started hearing the voices a little bit after the vehicular stalking.
Randall Ringer says the voices started when he was undergoing chemotherapy.
The first thing that was said was Randall Ringer. And I sat up straight and I went to into the bathroom, and I looked in the mirror, looked myself in the eyes, and I said, did that really happen?
Bond says he's found more than 300 victims locally and is tracking others across the state through billboards. In Johnson Valley, a Freedom House just opened to help people who believe they are being targeted.
To many of you who find yourselves the object of covert harassment, that there is hope and that you are not alone, and that we are striving to find legislation and we're working towards freedom for all.
Derek Robinson leads a national group called Freedom from Covert Harassment and Surveillance. He says he knows who's playing mind games.
Rogue government officials that are sponsoring this, also corrupt business officials, and private citizens.
And he also told us how.
Most of it is delivered by microwave, and I believe it's satellite delivered, whether someone is on a remote location using a laptop or next door using the desktop.
Bond says neurotransmitter chips that run off body electricity have been inserted into some people.
And they assign cell phone numbers to them. The cell phone numbers are then run through a computer, and a computer translates your thoughts. This crime has been available to the military for 60 years.
So imagine if you were alive like 200 years ago, and you was riding your horse out through wherever, and you came up on some people and they had something like walkie-talkies, right? And then, hey, blah blah blah, and then somebody comes back, hey, you'd be mind blown. You'd be like, what in the world? It's magic. They've got a magic device, and it's been like that over the last 100 years, 120 years, where humanity went for a long, long time with not very much technology, at least in this modern human era that we know of. I mean, there's speculation of some sort of advanced technology way beyond what we can validate, thousands and hundreds of thousands of years ago or something like that. And we just don't know really what, how they built pyramids and had, the capability to machine things and stuff like that, 50,000 years ago. We don't know. But we do know that there was not very much technology 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. And we can find the archaeological evidence of pretty much how people lived in those days. And basically for thousands and thousands of years, if not, hundreds of thousands of years, it was sticks and stones and, fire and walking staffs and whatever. There wasn't any technology as far as electronic technology. And now in the last 100 years, basically, we've come so far from discovering electricity with a kite or whatever, however they did it, and then all the way up to all sorts of broadcast technology and crazy scientific molecular things. And it's pretty wild, but anybody from some time before then would be blown away, and they would be like, oh my God, this is magic. Like, you must be a demon. You must be magic, something like that, sorcerer. And, we're walking around with cell phones and all sorts of advanced technology that we're just born into it, and we don't know the difference. We don't know life without it. And we're very adaptable as a species. So if we have children today, and those children grow up in a world where teleporting is just a normal thing, then to them it will be a normal thing. Even to us, it seem magic and all kinds of stuff, but to them it would just be a normal thing. And you really got to equate that into your whole process with this neural monitoring stuff, because people haven't seen it. People haven't seen what's possible with all of this stuff. And there's always going to be the skeptics that haven't experienced remote neural monitoring, where people can connect to you and talk to you and know what you're thinking and all of that kind of stuff.
Okay, in this video, I want to talk to you about something called mind control using remote neural monitoring. I want to show you this pattern and kind of go over the details of this pattern, because it actually proves that remote neural monitoring is real. The focal point of this video is to, in fact, show how one is mind controlled using these technologies and using a very specific protocol. Based on research and development, it has been discovered and concluded that there are various functions in the body that operate on an extremely low frequency level. You can see here on the screen, the heartbeat rhythm is at 1 hertz. You can see things like phantom touch at 20 hertz. All of these are registered on the low frequency level using, for example, 1 hertz, so on and so forth. But it has been shown now and demonstrated that most of these frequencies, these low-level frequencies, can be duplicated by a computer if the signals are demodulated to be picked up and received by the brain and the central nervous system. Remote neural monitoring essentially uses a computer-based technology that transmits frequencies, and that is what this particular diagram is showing. It's showing the fact that there are computer-based programs or computer-based systems that are able to demodulate signal where it can be received or picked up by the brain. If you'll further notice this graph on the screen here, there's a 4-part process that targeted individuals go through. One includes satellite tracking. They're able, through remote neural monitoring, to track your whereabouts all times of the day, anywhere you go. And then it relays your GPS coordinates to a satellite, to a central command center. And then from that central command center, a supercomputer will send either messages or the targeting back to the individual. And that targeting can be anything from directed energy to messages. You'll hear voices. You'll feel a heating, burning sensation through the microwave fields. Here you'll notice some burn markings on my leg as a result of what I believe was directed energy burns, microwave burns on the leg. You'll notice the scarring that resulted from the directed energy. I have measured that, and I want to show you the measurements later on in the video. I want to go over this pattern here that basically points out the technology for remote neural monitoring. Those of us that are targeted individuals, many of us
have what's called remote neuromonitoring, which is a remote system set up to monitor brainwave functions and also alter brainwave functions. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over the technology here in the beginning, and I'm just going to kind of briefly gloss over this patent. So you'll notice this patent was filed on August the 5th, 1974. One thing I want to point out here is Project's MK Ultra, the CIA's program of research and behavior modification, had a joint hearing, a selected committee on intelligence and a subcommittee on health and scientific research. And this, in essence, was designed to end the MK Ultra program in 1977. You'll notice that this patent came out 1 year before this subcommittee hearing. If you'll notice here in the top left, it was actually fully developed and recorded April 20th, 1976. The abstract says here that this is an apparatus and method of sensing brain waves at a position remote from a subject, whereby electromagnetic signals of different frequencies are simultaneously transferred to the brain of the subject, in which the signals interfere with one another to yield a waveform which is modulated by the subject's brainwave. Now, I know that sounds really complicated, but I'm going to show you a diagram here in a minute on how that actually works. It says the interference waveform, which is representative of the brain wave activity, is retransmitted by the brain to a receiver where it is demodulated and amplified. And then the circle portion here, it says the demodulated waveform is then displayed for visual viewing and routed to a computer for further processing and analysis. The demodulated waveform also can be used to produce a compensating signal, which is transmitted back to the brain to affect a desired change in electrical activity therein. In other words, within the brain. In other words, they're able to both modulate and demodulate signals or frequencies from a remote location, an actual computer, and those signals can actually be demodulated and they can actually change the electric activity within the brain, electromagnetic signals within the brain. Now, here's a diagram that sort of goes over that theory that I just read. If you'll notice down here at the bottom right, you can see here the TI subject. This is the TI subject down here, illustrated by number 8. If you'll notice the signals that come into the brain here, numbers 41, 43, and 45. These signals all come from, 2 of them are incoming, 1 is outgoing, number 45 is outgoing. All right, so I want to look at number 41 first. If you'll notice 41, it starts up here at the demodulated portion section here, okay? And it initially comes from, if you'll notice, it comes from the computer here, and then it's demodulated. Then it goes through a series of amplifications, mixing. Then it's sort of routed through an RF power divider. And then it goes through what's called a frequency doubler. And that's mixed, and then it actually goes into the brain. All of this is for the purpose of taking frequencies, a number of different frequencies, as is said in this abstract here, where you can take a series of frequencies. You'll notice here it says different frequencies are simultaneously transmitted to the brain of the subject. Okay, that's what we're looking at here. So these different frequencies actually come through this process here. They're translated, and they're sort of dubbed together, if I could use that word, whereby they are received by the brain and modulated within the brain throughout the body, and they create a series of different effects. Now, for most targeted individuals, there are many, many, many different symptoms that we all kind of deal with. And it seems like many of us are different, and it's for obvious reasons. Plausible deniability is one of the main things that the perpetrators try to keep in the forefront. In other words, they don't want anyone to see a pattern of harassments between individuals. So they try to make everyone's harassment patterns different. And that's all done via computer. It's all done via frequencies. And that is what I want to show you here. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to copy this particular diagram and copy this diagram. And then what I want to do is I want to go down and show you the object of this invention. It says, and I'm right here on the left side of the screen here. It says, it is therefore an object of the invention to remotely monitor electrical activities of the entire brain or selected local regions thereof with a single measurement. Another object is the monitoring of the subject's brainwave activities through transmission and reception of electromagnetic waves. Still another object is to monitor brainwave activities from a position remote from the subject. A further object is to provide a method and apparatus for affecting brainwave activity by transmitting electromagnetic signals thereto. So you'll notice here, and this is kind of the key point here that I want to kind of hone in on, because this is what a lot of targeted individuals deal with in their targeting under the category of electronic harassment. Electronic harassment takes in a number of different facets of targeting and harassment. For many of us, it starts with remote neuromonitoring, because it would be very difficult to effectively control someone's mind if you couldn't monitor their mind in the first place. So they have computer systems set up where they can actually read the effects from the brain wave transmission. They can read the effects of the harassment, whether it's mild or intensive, and they can sort of govern it that way. This is very, very long, and a lot of it is very intense technological information or details, all right? But I do want to go through a portion that I think is very significant for targeted individuals, and it starts here, number 60, right here at the left side of the screen here, number 50 actually. It says the computer, now I'm going to drop the diagram here. I might have to manipulate it. I don't know if you'll be able to see it correctly, but I'm going to try to drop the diagram here to show you. Yeah, I don't know if this is going to work or not. So we'll put it right there for now. It says the computer processes of the amplification brainwave 60 signal to derive information suitable for viewing by suppressing, compressing, or expanding elements thereof, or combining them with other information-bearing signals, and present that information on a display. Now, if you'll notice here on this diagram, I'm going to put it here just so you can see it. Number 60, this is number 60 right in here. That's the computer source. The signals come from that computer source. They go through a series of demodulations and mixing, and then finally they're transferred to sort of an RF field, RF frequency or RF field, where they are then dubbed together. These frequencies are dubbed together, and they're introduced as incoming signals to the targeted individual's brain, okay? And, you know, I'm going to show you sort of a diagram of how that works here in a little while. Let me go back here to the patent here. It says the display can be conventional ones such as the types hereby mentioned, employing electronic visual display or mechanical plotters. The computer can also be a conventional type, either analog or digital, or a hybrid. A process of the entire brainwave emission patterns may be monitored, or selected areas of the brain may be observed in a single measurement simply by altering the scan angle and direction of the antennas. There's no physical contact between the subject and the monitoring apparatus. The computer also can determine a compensating waveform for transmission to the brain to alter the natural brain waves in a desired fashion. All right, skipping over here to this portion here that I wrote, very important. It says modulations of the interference signal transmitted by the brain may be of amplitude, frequency, and or phase. Appropriate demodulators may be used to decipher subject brain's activity. Select components of his brain wave may be analyzed by a computer to determine his mental state and monitor his thought processes. All right, so you can see here, and this is kind of the reason why I wanted to go to this point, was because of this particular area here that tells us that a person's brain waves can be monitored both while they're sleeping as well as while they're awake for the purpose of monitoring thought processes, also for monitoring any activity that the brainwave registers from the body. It could be when you're walking, when you're eating. It could be anything you're doing with your extremities, whether it's your right arm or your left arm. Your brain registers all of that through the central nervous system. Well, that information is sort of modulated and demodulated, and it's picked up by a remote computer, where it in turn reads out that communication, which allows them to monitor everything you're doing. And they can in fact send back frequencies to essentially, you know, if they choose to harass in a certain area of the body, they can do that. If they choose to send voices or send any type of noise or any type of sound frequency, it can be picked up by the brain and it can actually register. In the next paragraph, it reads, as will be appreciated by those familiar with the art, apparatus, and method of the subject invention, has numerous usages. Persons in critical positions, such as drivers and pilots, can be continuously monitored with provisions for activation of an emergency device in the event of human failure. Now keep in mind, this invention was created 1976. We've never heard anything about this invention from 76 until now. At least I haven't. But yet and still, the invention was created in 1976, and ironically, it was created and patented 1 year before what they wanted us to believe was the end of the MK Ultra program.
The integration of the Internet of Bio-Nano Things, they are also calling it the intra-body internet, with artificial intelligence and molecular communications technology is now required to achieve e-health. Now, what does that mean? It means that the telecommunication industry and other industries, like the medical industry, mandated each human being to integrate a cyber-physical system for e-health, for the new fancy wireless biomedical telemetry system, for synthetic biomedical engineering in vivo. There are standards, IEEE 1906.1. So here you've got molecular or nanoscale machines, an intrabody nanosensor network, hydrogel that melts right into your tissue, But our, in quotation mark, good doctors are telling you, there was some kind of vaccine, you can cleanse it out of you. Well, they're busy, to log in and to use that new fancy wireless biomedical telemetry system for intra-body nano communication. Because that's what it is. Have you heard them use the term bio-cyber interface or intra-body nanosensor network? I bet you haven't.
What we're here to talk about today is the fact that the brain is and will be the 21st century battlescape in many ways. End of story. We could stop it there and I could let you go back to your respective units and think about that for a while, but I'm here to tell you absolutely, as much as there's a big old Tyrolean nose on this face, that you will encounter some form of neurocognitive science that has been weaponized not only in your military career, but in your personal and professional lives, irrespective of whether those two things coincide or not. So the idea of the brain as the battlescape is very important, and more importantly is this other acronym that's up there, which is WMD squared. Please get used to this because this is going to be part of the idea of irregular warfare and ongoing military innovation in your careers. Weapons of mass destruction and disruption. Disruption and influence will be the key to creating peer capabilities and asymmetrical engagements. Let me say it again. It will be the key to creating peer capability and asymmetrical relations and engagements. If we talk about what brain science is, let me just give you a little bit of brief background on this field that is now called neuroscience. As a titular field, as a named field, neuroscience has only been in existence for 40 years. I know that because I've been a neuroscientist for about 38 of those 40 years. When I first applied to get into a program in neuroscience, there were only 4 neuroscience programs in the continental United States. 4. Right now, at this particular point, there are well over 200 dedicated university and collegiate programs, several programs at the junior college level, several programs at the high school level, and many, many dozens of independent think tanks and philanthropic organizations solely devoted to brain sciences. That's just here in the United States. Furthermore, what becomes critically important for you to understand is that brain science is not just a United States enterprise or effort, nor is it singularly an effort of the United States allies worldwide. Increasingly, it is becoming an international, multinational, global, and independently exercised event and endeavor, which increases the capability of the brain sciences to develop not only new theories, but ever more sophisticated tools. I like this slide a lot because what it presents for you, ladies and gentlemen, is essentially a century-long history of brain science, even before it was called neuroscience. Look, let's face it, for as long as human beings were looking in some reflective pool and recognized that the thing looking back at them was themselves, there was some interest in what makes me me, what makes me think, what makes me feel, what makes me behave the way I do and you behave and think the way you do. What is my sense of self? Do I have free will, and what is the nature of that? And how can we affect that in a variety of ways that go from the non-kinetic all the way to the kinetic? If we take centenary jumps into the era of the Enlightenment, we can see the great thinkers that came before and during the Enlightenment, inclusive but not limited to people like René Descartes, pondered the idea of what that means. Cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. The inverse of the statement that in many cases was implicit but now becomes ever more explicit is what makes me think. And if I can understand what makes me think and makes you think and makes you feel, then that understanding may in fact flavor, if not directly influence, the way you and I interact. But more than that, if in fact I understand how it is that your brain does what your brain does, I may be able to access your brain and affect your brain, indirectly and directly. And what this allows us to do is to create tremendous potential and possibility and probability, potential, possibility, and probability of what the brain sciences can do and will do. Remember these 3 letters, A, and A. Keep them as your viable mantra for the duration of this course, today, and throughout your professional careers and each and all of the opportunities that you have to interface and try to understand the power that the brain and cognitive sciences can yield. A, the ability to assess the brain and its functions. A, the ability to access the brain on a variety of levels, from the subcellular all the way to the social. And A, the ability to affect the brains and the individuals in which those brains are embodied and the ecologies in which those individuals enact, engage, encounter, from the level of the individual to the group to the community to the populational. Look at the power that understanding tools and techniques of the brain sciences afford. It's there before you on the screen. Obviously, if in fact this gives me some insight to the way people interact, inclusive of the way they may interact in bellicose, aggressive, violent, and volatile ways, and it also confers upon me certain powers to be able to influence that, alter that, change that, mitigate that, then clearly I'm able to use the brain sciences, as we have tried repeatedly in the past, to influence the postures and capabilities not only of our own individuals who are engaged in warfare, intelligence, and national security operations, but those who seek to threaten us. In other words, we can utilize these things in national security, intelligence, and defense. Please look at the timeline. A mere 10 years ago, in 2008, the National Academy of Sciences National Research Council convened a group to create a report dedicated to if and why and how brain sciences might be viable, valid, and of value in national security, intelligence, and defense operations. And in 2008, they did a 5-year retrospective and came to the conclusion that although these things may be valid, their relative viability and value at that particular time rendered them not ready for prime time play. Our group, working with others internationally, inclusive of the Nuffield Council in the UK, proceeded forward from 2008 and did a slightly deeper dive, looking at international capabilities, limitations, and delimitations in the brain sciences, and came to a very, very different set of conclusions. Not only were the brain sciences increasingly being considered, interested, and used for possibilities of national security, intelligence, and defense, but they would continue to be so as more and more countries internationally developed the capabilities and the specialized agendas to be able to look into the brain and affect the brain. So much so that by 2014, the exact same committee reconvened and recognized at that time that the brain sciences indeed were ready and in operational prime time for warfare, intelligence, and national security agenda. In other words, it is valid, valuable, and already in operational play. The brain is the current and future battle space, or at least one that can be leveraged in those ways to be able to create tremendous effect with fairly little investment of engagement. In other words, what it allows us to do is assess the brain, access the brain, and affect the brain. I'll unapologetically repeat myself throughout this lecture to drive home this point with regard to these capabilities because each and all have gravitas importance and operational leverageability. That said, what are these techniques and technologies that have rendered this capability and, if you will, geopolitical, military, and social power? Well, I have them here before you. Generalization, we could parse them down into 2 discrete domains. First, the assessment neurotechnologies that do exactly as the name would imply. They are based upon various tools that we can use to assess those structures and functions of the brain that may be involved in those processes of cognition, emotion, and behaviors. Humans are tool users. Rarely, however, do we turn over a rock, look around a corner, or peer under the bed just to know what's under there. We use, at very, very least, the knowledge we have gained from turning the rock over and looking under the bed or around the corner. And very often, those things that we find under the rock, under the bed, or around the corner become tools for us to use in a variety of other engagements. Brain science, like any other science and technology, is no different. Earlier in the day at lunch, Major and I had a conversation about the viability of different types of research. Science for science's sake. Science just to know because that's where your interests lie. Oh, look, I've been an academic for well over 4 decades. And I can tell you that that kind of research is wonderful. But when that research is generated for a purpose and when it's funded and when that purpose deals with those things that are near and dear to the health, survivability, flourishing, and protection of kith and kin, then that research is operational research that has an end goal of use. This is what this is about. It's not just a question of trying to figure out what makes the brain tick in the way it's built. It's can we get in there to affect the ticking and talking, and by affecting the way that brain is built and the way it functions, influence in ways that are kinetic and non-kinetic, the attitudes, beliefs, thoughts, emotions, activities, and relative vulnerabilities and predispositions of those individuals for whom both we are responsible in terms of our own forces, perhaps to make them better, more insulated against injury, operationally protected and enhanced, and those who may threaten us. To do that, we need to intervene. So the other dimension of these neurotechnologies are interventional neurotechnologies. Now, I'm not going to bring you down the rabbit hole into what each and all of these things do, because you don't want to be a neuroscientist, and I'm certainly not going to make you a neuroscientist in an hour. But I think it becomes important to dial into a little bit more clarity and with further granularity what we're really talking about when we talk about these relative assessment and interventional technologies. In the former case, probably the one that gives the most rise to both provocation and contention, are various forms of neuroimaging, the ability to image the living brain, to be able to see what brain areas are differentially active as we engage in different thoughts, feelings, emotions, and tasks, and to then correlate the interaction of those nodes and networks with discrete patterns that occur not only in individuals, but in groups of individuals. In other words, if I can see how this gentleman's brain works, whether he's awake or falling asleep, thought I'd catch you. The idea there is that I can then understand, I'm only kidding, I can understand better, relax, I can only understand better not only what makes him happy, agitated, engaged, or tired, but I can then in some way alter my discourse to be able to make him feel happier, more engaged, and less tired. In so doing, I can take the information I have about the way a brain works, and I can put it to good use, practical use. Think about this. If I know what makes you tick as an individual, and I'm then able to generate patterns of how you as an individual relate to, are similar to, or different from other individuals, I may be able to then generate information that allows me to interact with you on ways that are more meaningful to our level of interaction. In other words, the more I know about what makes you tick, the more my interactions can be geared with you to make you tick the way I want you to. The way I want you to. Obviously, it takes some energy to put people into a big magnet and scan their brain. There's a whole bunch of things that are limitations of brain imaging. We recognize that. That's part of the mission. We seek to delimit those particular constraints and through the use of co-registered different forms of neuroimaging make it better. Some of these forms of neuroimaging are fieldable, operationalizable in field missions. Some of them are not. We're seeking to make these things more operationalizable, not only for military medicine to assess individuals who may have incurred brain injury and or the effects of brain injury inclusive of things like PTSD and other forms of neuropsychiatric disorders, but also to understand better how it is that our individuals are able to think through certain situations, how their brains work, and be able to classify those individuals and perhaps specify the way we train them, the way we sustain that training, and the way we maximize their performance. We can use other methods as well. Genetics, biomarkers, and information. And that information is critical. One of the things you must learn is as military personnel, your demographic, biological, social, and psychological information exists in your jacket and is in fact retrievable in real time. That information becomes ever more important as we try to understand the you-ness of you. And the nature to classify that information, hold that information secure, doesn't only exist on the medical side with regard to your HIPAA records, but increasingly is becoming a concern for national security when these large-scale big databases of brain structure and function, physiology, biopsychosocial demographics become ever more available and ever more relevant to what's making you tick, what's making you talk, what's making you strong, and what's making you vulnerable. And the fact that other nations, inclusive of China and Russia, are engaging in large-scale neuro-big data initiatives to be able to create large-scale databases that can join not only imaging and physiological, but as well as other forms of phenotypic and genetic data of the entirety of populations renders great power because there's great capability in that information to know where key points of strength and vulnerability may lie, and also to intercede, to inject information in some way be able to affect what appears to be your medical record, your personal record, the evidence that is you. And we can take that step to go one step further. The more I know about you and the more I know about the way your brain works as individuals, groups, communities, and even populations, the more I can utilize non-kinetic means, such as informational means of narratives, iconographies, semiotics, to influence your emotions and your behaviors. We can do this subliminally through computer images. We can do this more liminally through the types of engagements, interactions that we engage through psychological operations and informational operations. We can train better our human terrain teams to be able to interact with individuals in a variety of cultures, groups, settings, and ecologies to be able to improve their performance so as to be less distancing and more ameliorating. We can go further than that as well. We can also utilize these interventional technologies in those ways that may able to directly affect the brain. Probably the one that you've heard about most recently, most contemporaneously in the literature, is the possibility to use some form of directed energy to affect physiology peripherally and also to affect the physiology and health of the brain. Case in point here, U.S. Embassy personnel in Havana and possibly in China. And of course, there's not a lot that I can tell you about that, although I am one of the researchers on that particular project. But this seems to be wholly indicative and supportive of the fact that this was at least some form of directed energy, whether it was wholly intentional or not, still remains to be definitively decided. However, the pattern of insult and injury to those individuals and the pattern of injury of who was affected strongly suggests that this was an intentional and directed engagement, and that this represents a beta test, a possible probe of a directed energy neuroweapon. And there are a number of countries that had developed initiatives and agenda towards developing just these types of things, the United States included. But you also have a whole host of other things that can go bump and bang in your brain. The more we understand the specificity of the brain on a very granular level, the more we're able to derive and develop particular types of drugs that not only can enhance and optimize the performance of our people, but can also be used to mitigate, militate, and in some cases manifest profound morbid changes in their people. In other words, against a hostile other. Drugs can be exceedingly specific, and as I'll show you in a moment, can be very, very much used to individualize weaponology in terms of what we call precision pathology or precision effect. We can go further. Clearly, one of the things we can also do is transcranial neuromodulation, the idea of going through the skull to modulate the node and network activity of the brain, to optimize the performance of key individuals in certain tasks and performances that are relatively to their missional space. And we can also do that against hostile or perhaps belligerent others. We can go further to implant certain brain-machine interfaces. These are many of the DARPA programs that you may hear of now. Probably the one that is most notorious, in a very good sense, is something called the N3 program, which is the non-invasive neurosurgical neuromodulation program being run by their program manager, Dr. Al Mundi. The idea here is to put minimal-sized electrodes in a network within a brain through only minimal intervention to be able to read and write into the brain function in real time, remotely. The United States is not alone in such efforts. And then, of course, you also have the things that are a little bit more traditional. If we talk about things that can be operable in the biochemical space, we ordinarily talk about drugs, bugs, toxins, and ever more, we're considering devices. At the last Biological Toxins and Weapons Convention, the RevCon, it was then raised by the Australia group that we need to be a little bit more salient in our attention to those possible neurotechnological devices that may be able to be weaponized. Our group has also argued that the current considerations and extant categories of the Biological Toxins and Weapons Conventions are not detailed enough to be able to appreciate or keep pace with the advances in this form of science that can be weaponized that poses a risk and threat on the battle space. So, how then can we use these elements as weapons, means of contending against others? Formal definition of a weapon, right out of the Oxford Old English Dictionary. Means of contending against others. And we can do that in a number of ways. We can militate their behaviors and their thoughts in some ways as to make them more amenable to what we do, the idea of positive weaponology. Or we can, in fact, mitigate and in some cases completely nullify their capability, will, or engagement to fight. If we combine those two definitions into one, what we find is those agents that will either change individuals' thoughts, vulnerabilities, volatility to violence and aggression, or incur morbidity, dysfunction, and or mortality in such a way as to then mitigate the engagement altogether. You still with me? That said, we can break down any form of weaponology into two discrete categories: soft weapons and hard weapons. In the former categorization, soft weapons include but are not limited to such things like economic leveraging to create economics, market values, market presence at international bargaining tables to develop international power and leverage as a soft weapon. Clearly, the more we're able to make an impact in a field, in a dimension, by virtue of research, medicine, technology, infiltration into a variety of areas of the public space, the more we're able to yield economic strong-arming, economic leveraging. I think an important consideration that I'll reiterate later in this particular lecture is that there are countries outside the United States and or the West that are increasing their capabilities by intent in the brain sciences so as to be able to gain this type of economic leveraging in international global markets, in medicine, science, technology, and the military. Most notably among them is China. We'll talk more about that momentarily. But we can also utilize weapons in more of a soft approach, as I mentioned earlier. The more I know about what makes you tick, the more I might be able to do things like weaponize the approach that I then take towards you in my interactions and engagements with you. Here we can utilize the brain sciences for psychological operations. Most notably, one of the DARPA programs run by the program manager Bill Casebeer, Dr. Bill Casebeer, who subsequently went on to be a program manager at Lockheed Martin and run their brain-machine interfacing programs. Bill Casebeer's program was called Narrative Networks. And one component of the Narrative Networks project was something called neural narratives. If we understand how it is that brains and individuals, groups, and populations respond to certain forms of imaging, memes, iconographies, engagements, the more we may be able to tailor those things through our psychological operations, propaganda, miso, to be able to engage these individuals in more positive ways or in ways that are more influential, to be able to direct their behaviors, their predispositions, and perhaps their engagements with us on a variety of levels, from the individual all the way up to the political. But then, of course, we move into the more harder forms of weapons, things such as bullets and bombs. And here, once again, let me reiterate what we're talking about on the neuro side, are drugs, bugs, toxins, and devices. But of course, if we spill over the idea of soft weaponology into a hard weaponization, we also see the use of biodata as a viable weapon. Manipulating biodata so that I can then put into your particular medical records subtle information that may change the disposition of whether you're sick or not, change how you're treated, influence the postures that go to you in terms of insurance, care, viability for military service. By altering that information, by changing those data, by purloining those data, I essentially change the you of you. And I can do that in very subtle and insidious ways. Furthermore, I can do that on a variety of different levels that can affect key individuals so that in fact your medical record changes to thereby render you incapable or at least invalid to be able to serve in a way you're serving. Or I can do that on a much larger scale, groups, populations. And if I change those data, I change the way you're being regarded and treated. And I can do that in one of two ways. I can do it in such a way that you're going to be regarded in a negative sense, or I can do that in such a way that I'm going to treat you incorrectly. If I say, for example, you have a particular allergy, or you have particular sensitivities, or you have a particular disorder, you will be treated for that, and that could then harm your health and your stability in both a short wars approach as well as a long wars approach. But if we take a look at this in a little more detail, you can see that once again it folds back to the idea of what can we do to ours and what can be done to others. Clearly, one dimension, one domain of operational viability and value is to enhance the capabilities of the combat and intelligence operator across a range of scalabilities in both general purpose and more select forces. And this is the idea of neuroenablement. Neuroenablement. You will hear this referred to in a variety of different ways. Performance optimization, enhancement, enablement, maximization. These terms mean something. A number of years ago, our group was tasked with the Air Force to develop a lexicon, a nomenclature that would be able to define these in more precise ways. I'll not bore you with that now. But the idea of enablement gives forth, I think, a particular meaning that's relevant. You're enabling individuals to do some aspects of a performance of a task that is germane and justified to their operational mission and that is, in fact, done with regard to protection of their charges. So in other words, we're saying, we're going to make you good to go, and we've decided that this is good. The reason this can become problematic, of course, is that what definition of good are we using? What we define, whoever the proverbial we may be, to be good, might be quite different than what they, whoever the proverbial they is. And as a consequence, we have to keep a much broader window of opportunity and possibility open to be aware for the potential benefits, burdens, and risks that this type of engagement may pose. What types of things can we do to make our people better, if you will? Well, certainly we can use a variety of advanced psychopharmacologics and neuropharmacologics, in other words, drugs. And I refer you to a wonderful book written by a colleague of mine, Professor Jonathan Moreno, called Mind Wars. First edition came out in 2006, second edition came out in 2012. And Professor Moreno does a very good job in defining and explaining the history and historicity of the way the brain and cognitive sciences had been used in national security, intelligence, and defense operations, both by the United States and more globally. And what we see is that this is certainly not a new event. We can look back into antiquity and see that there have been attempts to try to maximize the performance, capability, sustainability, and protection of those individuals who are operational warfighters, literally from ancient Rome and Greece all the way to the 20th and now 21st century. It's the tools and techniques based upon the understanding and depth that we have that increases the granularity and specificity of effect and increases sophistication and gravitas of outcome. The more we know about the brain, the more we can develop ever more selective agents to affect the structures and functions of the brain in cognition, emotion, and actions, and the more we can do so in a way that's more like sharpshooting rather than buckshotting. But irrespectively, drugs can be somewhat dirty. What I mean by that is they can have a host of adverse effects, some of them side effects, some of them direct effects. And very often what we'll find is that unless we're able to deliver the drugs directly to a particular site in the brain or elsewhere in the nervous system, they can have heterogeneity of effects throughout the body. And that can lead us to some undesirable outcomes. But we don't need to be limited to drugs. No. We can also use a variety of computational brain-machine interfaces that are both closed and open loop. And these include things like transcranial magnetic and electrical stimulation, stimulating the vagus nerve transdermally, or if you wanted to get somewhat more invasive but certainly more specific, brain-machine interfaces by virtue of deep brain and superficial brain implants. And I shall tell you that one of the leading projects in developing state-of-the-art brain implants is a DARPA-funded project aimed at the medical side for the treatment of neurological and neuropsychiatric spectrum disorders. And this program is called SubNets, Systems-Based Neurotechnologies for Emerging Therapies. But what you also need to appreciate is that that DARPA program, like any program that is oriented towards engaging brain function to then alter those functions in certain ways, directional ways, can be harnessed for what's called dual use. Medical purposes that are then depurposed to medicine and used for other agenda, inclusive of warfighter enablement and enhancement. Furthermore, we understand that there are a number of nations outside the United States, some of whom are allied, others that are at least competitive, if not combative, that are engaged in these types of programs looking at the capability for transcranial and deep intracranial modulation of brain function to improve the functional performance of military and intelligence operators across a range of viable missional tasks. We are not alone in these pursuits, and I think that's something that needs to be appreciated. But it's not just a question of what we can do to our own, because very often in raising these questions, we tend to, what I call, err on the side of moral probity, and we recognize that there are particular limitations, limits, boundaries, thresholds that cannot and perhaps should not be crossed in terms of what we can do. And if we intend to cross them, we only cross them with consent, and that consent is highly contingent upon the necessity of a continuity of research and clinical care, understanding what happens to the individual once they've been enabled and enhanced, and what may happen when they're no longer enabled and enhanced. In other words, more colloquially, when Superman goes back to being Clark Kent, what happens to Clark becomes the burden and obligation of our responsibility. However, those ethics are not homogeneous on the world stage. And the idea of pushing the envelope of what can be done to the combat, warfighter, and intelligence operator, and perhaps more broadly to those individuals who may oppose particular regimes and or may be military fighters against your own regime, is very often bounded by, and in some cases deconstricted by philosophies, cultures, and ethics of those individuals who may be competitive, if not combative to us. So in other words, this can also be weaponized against others. And this is where we get into the idea of novel neuroweapons. Once again, this is not necessarily new, but the momentum of this dimension of the field has accelerated as a consequence of increased understanding of the brain and increased capability to develop tools and techniques to access and affect the brain. So what are we seeing here? Well, take a look. We see enclosed neuropharmaceuticals and organic toxins. What's new about this is the enclosed nature of this. Increasingly, we're not seeing these things as weapons of mass destruction against gross aspects of the population, although certainly many neuroweapons such as sarin gas and VX and other forms of neurotoxic agents can be leveraged against large groups of people, but that's messy. More specifically, perhaps, might be targeting individuals on a level that allows either direct attribution or covert engagement with non-attribution. Let me give you an example of what I mean. So this gentleman is the leader of some group, a political group, a social group, a combative group, and under the veil of a white flag, he and I are now to have some kind of a caucus, a meeting. And during that meeting, what I do is I lace the rim of his drink, or his pen, or his seat, or something in his immediate environment with very, very low-dose drug or toxins that are going to affect his stability. They may affect the way his brain works, and as a consequence of that, they can affect the functions of his brain, his thought patterns, his relative emotionality, and the behaviors that go along with that. One of two things might happen. He might be completely incapacitated as a consequence of this, or he may change his level of capacity and engagement so that he went into the meeting thinking, I hate this guy's my enemy. He walks out of the meeting going, I love this guy's great. Now what could happen? If in fact this is a gentleman who has charismatic, financial, elected, or dictatorial power, it may be that his followers will then follow him blindly. He came into the meeting as a leader of those followers who were bellicose, who were volatile, who were violent and aggressive. He comes out of the meeting, he tells them to change their behaviors, and they do. Or I could sever the trust. By now, he leaves this meeting, he's espousing a very different philosophical stance and orientation, and his followers no longer adhere to his precepts, his tenets, or his lead, and I fractured the relative arrangement of trust, engagement, capability that he fostered, leaving that population disrupted and vulnerable to intervention, to a coup d'etat, to a junta, to some type of insertive reassumption of leadership. You see how this can work? Furthermore, I can use this very tactically. Some of these agents allow me to assemble the agent on site and not have to stockpile it, which allows me to take the components of this agent into and out of a country relatively covertly, target a specific individual, change or eliminate that individual with very little attribution and trace, and be able to leave prior to any attribution. Think Novichok. Or I could assemble very small quantities of this that would then allow a specific intervention, characteristically in a place that would not allow such an intervention. Think of the use of a derivative of Vx in an airport. But I could do more than that. I could also incur much broader type of ripple effects. And one of the ways I could also do that is with what's called high morbidity neuromicrobiologic agents. It's a real fancy way of saying neurobugs. But high morbidity neurobugs. I may not want to kill a lot of people. In fact, arguably, I may assume what is sometimes referred to as the Sailor-Malin mantra. For those of you who may be fans or students of military history, you may remember that Sailor-Malin, Wing Commander Sailor-Malin, was a South African who flew with the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. And he became well known during the Battle of Britain for shooting up German airplanes but letting them limp home, particularly bomber aircraft. And they would ask Sailor-Malin, "Oh, Wing Commander, why didn't you shoot that plane down?" And his adage was simple. Better to have that plane return home with wounded crew who are spitting up their lungs, one dead crewman that they had to attend to and therefore divert their missional capability while in flight, than shoot them down. Because the psychological effect will be rippling and devastating. This is sometimes referred to as the Malin effect. What can I do? I can use a particular bug that I may be able to now modify through the use of gene editing technique that is ubiquitously available and fairly easy to use to take a bug that was previously relatively benign and non-pathogenic and make that bug virulent, pathogenic, dangerous. And then what could I do? I could introduce that bug in key sites. Des Moines, Seattle, Tampa, Newark, Houston. I'd get a few people sick. I'd do it on an airplane, do it at an airport, do it at a sporting event, do it on Black Friday. And then what I would do is I would take credit for that, but I'd want to make sure that at least part of the symptomatic constellation was not only neurological, was profoundly psychological. Agitation, debilitation, sweating, stomach problems, sleeplessness, cardiac problems, things that are what we call top-down neurological in their effect, brain to body and body to brain in the bottom-up cascade. Then what I would do is I would get on the internet, and I would put out over the internet, "I did it. Oh yes, I'm that dangerous G group that you should all be afraid of. And in fact, this is far more ubiquitous than I let on. These are only the first cases. I've let these buggies go all over the country, and your early warning signs are agitation, anxiety, worry, sleeplessness, stomach problems, heart problems. What have I done? I've rippled the sheets of the worried well. At first blush, I get every hypochondriac running to their physician, but at second and third blush, I get those individuals who begin to become worried that they may have been exposed to this, that their children may have been exposed to this, that their loved ones, their kin, their kith may have been exposed to this. Of course, the physicians, the CDC, the Public Health Service comes back and says, no, that's not what's going on. But I get back on the internet and I say, oh, don't you listen to that. That's fake. That's false. Your government knows what's going on. They can't do anything about it and they can't treat you. They're going to end up quarantining you. How many people would I need to affect? We modeled it. Somewhere between 12 and 240. What would be the effect? Hang on, folks. Within 41 to 45 days, we would crash the United States public health system. Crash it. In so doing, I render the United States infrastructure vulnerable, either there or elsewhere. See the ripple effect? See the disruptive effect? I can disrupt an individual from the level of their cell to their system, and disrupt individuals on a variety of levels, from individuals all the way up to the social fabric. And that social fabric may go even further. It may be geopolitical. I need you to think just for a moment, if you could, why would it be of any value at all to affect, disrupt, and disable individuals who are U.S. Embassy personnel in Havana? When did it happen? What was happening? What would be the benefit in fracturing a growing economic, political, and social trust in that part of the world? Who would benefit? What would be the long-term effects, for example, of at least indicating that U.S. Embassy personnel and Foreign Service personnel are vulnerable to these types of threats? Could you, in fact, pair the threat with some type of conditioned stimulus? So now what you're able to do is to evoke a response in the worried well. I only offer possible suggestions for your speculation and your consideration, if you will. We can even go further. One of the newest developments is that nanoparticulate matter can be stabilized for distribution. If you're not aware what nanoparticulate matter is, it's that matter which exists on a scale of 1 × 10⁹. Very, very small. Smaller than a cell. And we can manufacture materials that have discrete properties that can be controlled by virtue of bioengineering and their physical chemistry. To auto-aggregate, to be able to aggregate in particular areas based upon their biological and or chemical sensitivity. But now we go one step further. Most recently, just a few weeks ago, it was announced that you could then aerosolize nanomaterials. And go one step further, I can create small robotic units, controllable robotic units at the nanoscale, and that these too can be aerosolized to create a nanoswarm of biopenetrable materials that you cannot see, that can penetrate all but the most robust biochemical filters, that are able to integrate themselves through a variety of membranes, mucous membranes, and wherever, mouth, nose, ears, eyes, can be then uptaken into the vascular system to create clumping, can affect the vascular system of the brain, or can directly diffuse into the brain space, and these can be weaponized. And they can be done in such a level that their presence is almost impossible to detect, and as such, the attribution becomes exceedingly difficult to demonstrate. How much of this material would I need? Take a look. This is the front of my pen. This amount of nanomaterial, if be able to maintain and sustain with regard to its deliverability and aerosolization, could in fact affect all of you, or based upon where I come from, New York City, all yous. Look at this. Look at this. I'm carrying that material. Would you see it? Would I have to lug a giant weapon into the room? No, I wouldn't. And what if, in fact, I utilize some form of an unmanned aerial device or unmanned ground device as a delivery vehicle? Something like a drone or a bug. Could I do something with that? But let's keep going. Could I also utilize a whole host of devices to be able to affect individuals close in, for example, during interrogations, during social engagements, during human terrain team engagements, or more remotely, in a room, in a theater, in an airplane, in a bus, in a store, in a mall? The answer is increasingly yes. So this then represents for us both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge is that increasingly what we find is that neuroscience and technology is relatively easy to obtain. Many of the things that I've just spoken to you about are viable and obtainable directly to the consumer or directly to the scientist. We also know that many of the products that are available direct to consumer can be easily modified to create things that have a much higher weaponization potential. But more than that, we also recognize that there are dedicated efforts on the part of nation states and even groups of non-state actors, and increasingly virtual nations that are using virtual currencies to fund research efforts in these areas. I'd like to think that I'm a smart guy talking to a bunch of very intelligent individuals, but let's face it, we're not the only smart people in the world. And if we're thinking this way, there are plenty of other people who are thinking this way too.
I have been trying to tell for a long time is the reason why Robert O. Becker gets canceled by the same group of people. Why? Because he's doing work on non-native EMF electropollution for the US Navy. And the story that people don't really understand is how this ties to the progression that I made in the Danny Jones podcast. This is MK Ultra, graduates to SRI, Stanford Research Institute, then magically under Obama in 2013, You have the Brain Health Initiative. All of a sudden, everything goes to Central and South America. So I would have thought in some of these podcasts, ones I did with Danny, ones I've done with Adrian D'Amico, ones I did with Bulwark, but the last one, the big one, was when Breedlove came down here for 4 days and interviewed me, told them bits and pieces, and no one's asked me the real question. Why in the fuck did this thing morph? Well, turns out another guy, a part of this program, is a guy named Alan Fry. In the late 60s, he takes the work of Jose Delgado, the guy that everybody knows about the bull and the wires in the head. And then I told Danny at the end of this process, they found out they didn't need wires, they didn't need chips, they could do it with light. And he goes, what? That is the last part of the story that nobody seems to understand. So they begin to realize that they can use light frequencies to destroy the leptin melanocortin pathways in the brain to control people. They don't need LSD. They don't need mescaline. They don't need anything else, okay? And the reason why this program gets changed is during its evolution, they find out that people that have heavily melanated skin are the most difficult to control, okay? So there's another DARPA program that you may have heard about. I'm sure Whitney Webb and Mark Godwin have heard about it, but have never linked it to this story. It's called the Targeted Individual Program. In other words, how you control people utilizing remote technology. Well, who's the guy that actually really discovered this whole thing? Alan Fry. Alan Fry's looked at a good guy in my world. Why? He's the first guy that showed that when you zap a brain with any type of electromagnetic radiation, it opens the blood-brain barrier. So you can take bad shit and get it in. What magically happens in the United States at that time? People start making processed food. What also magically happens? Drugs start to come on market, and they have a lot of fillers and preservatives in them. Guess what all those fillers and preservatives and all the fake processed shit was really about? It was about figuring out how to get toxins from your gut into your brain so that you could electromagnetically target them. That is actually what happens between MK Ultra into SRI. What do they find out in SRI? Where does the program stall? 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011. That's magically when Obama says we're going to get rid of incandescent bulbs, we're going to go to LEDs. What do they find out? Because LED bulbs remove UV and red light, have a huge blue spike. It turns out the blue spike can actually be used to control people through the dopamine pathway. How does that work? If you go back and listen carefully to what I said to Danny, and he clearly didn't get it, even though he's done podcasts with people that told him this in the past. Dopamine, or I should say melanin, breaks down into dopamine. If you open the blood-brain barrier, dopamine floods the brain and it causes brain damage. Anybody who's a healthcare practitioner, I guarantee you when Kevin listens to this, he'll understand it, knows that when we use dopamine in an ICU setting, we have to be extremely careful with it, when we're trying to elevate their blood pressure, because a low dose, a medium dose, or high dose can kill you. When people are in the ICU, they're around electromagnetic devices. This is the reason why. Because we're flooding their brain with dopamine, we're flooding their brain with serotonin. There's even something called the serotonin syndrome that y'all can look up and fact check Uncle Jack. This is the key things that Alan Fry finds out for DARPA. And then what does DARPA originally do? Not only are they using directed energy weapons to try to control this, they are now checking this at scale in the United States. So what two things happen at the end of Obama's term that you guys may remember that's tied to this story? There is two things that happen. The first thing is a young African-American attorney who went to Florida State named Myron May goes into the Florida State Library with a gun, shoots the library up, doesn't shoot anybody else. And what does he do? He sends 10 people a package with the story of what I'm telling you right now. And he says, I know they're targeting me, but I don't know why. How did this all start? It's a very interesting story when you delve into it. He's comes from a poor background, had no medical problems. He had a Fitzpatrick score of 4. He wasn't like Nairobi, Kenya, but pretty dark. He starts to date a pediatrician from New Mexico. And magically, after they're dating for a while, he starts to complain of horrible back pain around his kidney and adrenal gland. He starts telling her, I think I need to go to the doctor. She goes, no, just treat it this way, that way. He goes to see a doctor in New Mexico who's a known entity in the DARPA program. He gets prescribed medications for ADHD. The pediatrician goes, why in the hell would they put you on something like this? What happens from there? He goes back to Florida. His behavior becomes more bizarre. He's telling people that he hears voices in his head. He has horrible pain in his chest and he doesn't know why. Ultimately, something happens to him where he figures out that somebody from the outside is actually targeting him for a reason and he doesn't know why. Here's the key part of the story, Marty. Turns out when you have a lot of melanin both inside and outside your body, this direct targeting device is bidirectional. See, when you don't have a lot of melanin, when they shoot it into you, you actually become a zombie, an obedient idiot. But when you're highly melanated, because what does melanin do? It absorbs massive amounts of radiation. For those of you who don't believe this, you can actually go look at the tests that we did on the hydrogen bomb, okay, on the atolls in the South Pacific. You may be shocked to hear this, but when we did that test, the United States military didn't even know what the thermonuclear capability of the bomb was that they were going to set off. Turned out they thought it was going to be about 7.5 megatons. It turned out, reality of the test, it was 15 megatons. That means that the blast area went into areas where regular people from the South Pacific lived. There's pictures that show these people lost their melanin in certain places on their body. You know why? Because that melanin absorbed the radiation blast for them. Okay? That's documented out there. So the government begins to realize that if they're going to use these devices as a weapon of war, that they've got to test it at scale on different folks. Turned out all the stuff that you hear about the TI people that are out there, these are people that are the randomized controlled clinical trial of DARPA on their own people before this weapon is ready for prime time. Just so you know, Marty, you may be asking, well, the Russians had the same technology as us. Why don't we see the same program there? Well, the Russians try to warn us. And this is where Becker's research comes in. Do you know, and you can look this up, there used to be something called the woodpecker frequency that emanted from Ukraine that went all the way around the globe at a specific latitude. This was an EMF device that the Russians put out to warn the United States that if you guys don't change what you're doing in terms of adopting electromagnetic radiation through cell technology, you're going to create a huge problem for people. And then when the United States military didn't listen to them, what did Russia do? This is where the Moscow embassy event happens. Remember, you probably heard as a young man about Havana syndrome, where all these guys in Cuba got zapped, right? You probably don't remember learning anything about what happened in the Moscow embassy. The Russians took a pulse microwave device and pointed it at the US embassy in Moscow from 1967 all the way to 1973. In that time frame, they had more diagnoses of tinnitus, Meniere syndrome, voices, mental illness, but here's the big one. We had 3 straight ambassadors develop blood cancers. Okay? Turns out in 1973, Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State, has to give hazard pay to anybody who was in the embassy at that time. Do you know how they solved the problem? You want to know where the idea of tinfoil hats came from, my friend? They put tinfoil all up in the U.S. embassy when they found out what the Russians were doing. And what did the Russians tell them? We're trying to warn you that what you're about to do is going to be a big problem. 1973, Marty, guess what else happens in 1973? Becker does the key paper on the sanguine antenna to use RF radiation pulsed to check all the Trident submarines all over. And he finds out through his work that this is a huge problem. So the Secretary of Navy and the other parts of DARPA know that this is a big issue because they're working on both parts of this story. So Becker gets so frustrated from 73 to 77, kind of like Kevin was about his story that you've been documenting with him every time you have him on. And he goes on 60 Minutes and tells the world the truth. Guess what happens to him? He gets fucking Bernice Eddied. Literally, they take all his money away. How do you censor a scientist? You just take their money away. And basically, a guy that's twice nominated for the Nobel Prize for his work in tissue regeneration, utilizing bioelectricity, gets zapped. Why? Also, the government continue this DARPA program that then gets morphed in 2008, first to get rid of incandescents and then to put LEDs, then it gets even more nefarious. Obama says we need to figure out how to get brown people more controlled. So they pick Central and South America. Why? They've got a good mix of Fitzpatrick's 2s, 3s, and 4s. They go down there and they start to perfect the targeting. What are they using to deliver the targets? They're using processed food. They're using jabs. They're using geoengineering. Things fall from the sky. And you may be saying, well, how does this really work, Jack? Like, what's the mechanism that's tied to it? This is where you don't get any of the Whitney Webb, Mark Godwin people understanding. When you open someone's blood barrier and you open up their gut barrier, that means that big toxins, higher atomic mass than a hydrogen proton, goes into places that it's not supposed to be. So, Marty, you're a smart guy. I think you know that Intel and AMD, when they make semiconductors, they have clean rooms, right? They don't want anything in there. Turns out your brain works on the same mechanism. How do we know that? Guess what Becker's work was on? He's the one that proves that our body works by semiconduction. They already took his research out. So what did the government do? They take high atomic mass elements and deliver them in ways that you can't imagine. How does this work, Marty? You have places in your body called the circumventricular organs. And remember, I'm a Bitcoiner, but what's my day job? I'm a brain surgeon. So I know a little bit something about the brain. The circumventricular organs sit around your hypothalamus and your thalamus. These are areas where you never have a blood-brain barrier. These become the target of DARPA. They start to deliver these things. Do you want to know why geoengineering really is a problem? Not only does it block the sun, but when this shit falls down in the ground, those elements wind up going through places where you don't have a blood-brain barrier. And if they can convince you to use those earphones that Apple sells, then they can really get you because it lets tons of stuff in. So all the keto snacks that all the food gurus want to sell you has nothing to do with the food. It has to do with all the shit that they put in there that's manufactured that has a higher atomic weight than should. What's the issue with drugs? Everybody knows the story about Columbine and every other school shooter, but you've never put it together. It's not the SSRI drug, it's the fillers and preservatives in it that are a problem. Here comes the big one, Marty. This is something Kevin didn't find out, but I'm going to tell you. We find out that every jab, not just the Pfizer one, every single one out there, including the one that was used in China, has 51 to 55 elements that are not supposed to be in there. You want to find out the really interesting part? All jabs have 100% chromium in them. Do you know why they pick chromium? It has a +6 oxidation state. What does that mean? Negative to +3. That means it's a much more tunable atom when it interacts with electromagnetic radiation. Want to hear something even crazier? Chromium isn't found in every single drug that Big Pharma makes. Did you know that?
I did not.
Right. So it gets better. You remember Aaron Brockovich? Remember the story about PG&E? What was the element that caused cancer in the people out there around their power lines and that place? Hexavalent chromium. Isn't that interesting, huh, Marty? So you got the story of these high atomic elements with non-native EMF, and it's always associated with these unusual diseases that humans are getting. This is the collateral effects of the bioweapons program. But it turns out, what DARPA finds out, is that the people that have the darkest skin are difficult to control.
This is a set of short videos explaining all these different concepts that we're talking about, like organized stalking, microwave weapons, and also the fancier weaponry that's now sadly in use. But for people who would like to follow, first of all, I would like to start with organized stalking. So organized stalking or gang stalking is reported by many, many people. And for a long, long time, they've been stamped as paranoid or schizophrenic. But this is actually a wrong diagnosis. It's essentially what it is box ticking from the psychiatrists who are experts in their own field but don't know about something else that's happening. And what you can, for example, show, and I'm pretty sure because this is something that I can even show, by just going online and having a look, is that there has been an explosion in people complaining about organized stalking and gang stalking. So for the last 16, 20 years, there has been this steady rise in ever more people complaining. And they seem to say all the same thing. I'm being ganged up on. That's number one. But also strange scenes are happening over and over to me. So much more than is normal. And what's also quite telling is that a lot of older people are reporting this, but also young people. And so for a long time, it has been just stamped as, oh, this is just paranoia, schizophrenia. But just stamping it like that and not doing the data analysis or not doing the actual investigation is just not good enough, because now it has literally exploded. So what is actually intermixed, and I'm now going to talk about the second half. And with every case, I'm not saying every case is one of the two categories. What I'm now talking about is the other category that is completely ignored by psychiatrists. So psychiatrists who have typically their knowledge from what they learned at university and what their field is printing in these magazines and these on congresses and these sort of educational courses. Well, all the knowledge that's presented there is based on just psychiatry and is based on typically the knowledge of the past 10 or past 20 or even past 30 years. And that doesn't take into account developments that are now happening and can be shown to happen. So I'm not going to talk about psychiatry because I'm absolutely not qualified to talk about that. But I'm going to talk about that aspect, which on the other hand, none of the psychiatrists are qualified to talk about, but which you can also map if you're studying current affairs, or there's many other indications, and I'm going to explain that. So I'm going to talk about the second category, which is what's always ignored. And the second category is the fact that the intelligence agency's budget has exploded. It has literally exploded. And for the United Kingdom, we've got very precise data because MI5's budget has doubled. This is absolutely unprecedented in the history of, I think, any intelligence agency. But it actually doubled. So, and that was in 2003. So you can look it up on The Guardian, and many other newspapers reported about that. But in 2003, the budget doubled. Okay, so what this means is that before you had already MI5, a big sprawling organization covering the entirety of UK, because they have to, right? I mean, they have to keep the entirety of the UK safe. And now the financial flow into this organization is such that from that year onwards, you can keep a second organization, right? This is what it means when the budget doubled. Before, it sustained an organization of a certain size. Suddenly after that, it can sustain two organizations of exactly the same size. So when an organization is given this much money, and this is a fact now, I'm not talking about hypotheses, this is a fact, the budget doubled, end of story. When this happens, an organization will have to use the money quickly. And typically if they don't use the money, you know that from the local council, for example. I mean, councils are famous for just digging up roads in spring in the UK, because the financial year ends in spring, and if they haven't spent the money, then they are not getting it the next day. So, where I lived, I always watched how in spring these crazy, work projects started, sometimes ripping up a road that they had just laid down the year before, and there were certain roads that were taken up, it seemed to me, every year. So to guarantee that the money is spent quickly on a small project at the end of the year, so that next year they get the big budget again. So the same thing also happens in all systems. So you can imagine that when this happens and this ginormous money flow starts coming in to an organization like MI5, they very quickly have to hire lots of agents, they have to double the number of the informants, and everything has to double. Everything has to double. But when you turn it on, suddenly the first year when you hired nobody, they are swimming in money. They are absolutely swimming in money. You see, because the hiring process has to be gradual. But if you get the money straight away and this is it's like someone opening a second pipe, it's just flooding in. The money is just flooding in. So what you expect from that, first of all, who do you think they can hire? Well, there's a lot of unemployed people, so they can only hire the unemployed, right? Or they can suck off people who are in other jobs, but that's unlikely, unless they give them really lucrative jobs. So you're looking for this system very rapidly recruiting unemployed people, young people who are maybe not in jobs, pensioners maybe, who want to earn money because they can't pay for the heating of their house, and this lot, okay? So what you expect when the budget doubles is that suddenly there will be this, fantastic amount of new hires who will be very quickly taught the tools of the trade. Now, what are the tools of the trade for MI5? It will be surveillance, right? So it will be stalking people, it will be bugging cars, bugging phones, bugging houses. It will be, following people. It will be setting up certain scenes that they control. Okay, that sort of stuff. Those are the tools of the trade, I mean, it's essentially surveillance, stalking, sabotage, street theater, scenes, disconcerting scenes, trying to read out people's reactions, listening into their conversation, anything that can, first of all, get information from them and then influence them, in their life will be it. So who are you going to train these people on? All these new, unemployed pensioners and young people. Who? Well, you need a lot of subjects for that, test subjects. So just by this fact that the budget of MI5 doubled, you expect a lot of unsuspecting people to come forward and say, I seem to be stalked by people. I seem to have my house under surveillance. All these things that seem to be happening. So this is not a surprise, people. That's what you freaking expect. Okay? Because if you double MI5's budget, they have to double their personnel. They have to. I mean, they can't just spend all this money on kit because you need people to operate the kit. So you either buy something really, really expensive, like you suddenly just buy satellites and you just scatter the sky with satellites. And I'm sure that happened too, but not just. Okay? So if they have got satellites, signal intelligence, they've got human intelligence and, lots of other, flavors. And each of those will have probably their budget doubled. So even if you're just talking human intelligence, you will have to double it. And it's already a big operation. And when you double it, you have to train people. You have to train new entries. So you automatically expect people to come forward and say, I am being stalked by... And then the telltale is, does it fall into the category that you would expect? If people come forward and say, I'm being stalked by fairies or space aliens, then it's probably paranoia, like classical, proper messed in the head. However, when they come forward and say, I'm being stalked by a lot of young people, like teenagers, early 20s, and I'm being stalked by a bunch of old men or old women, then that's what you would expect. Then you would think, hang on a second, you're in the UK, okay, I think it's much more likely that you fall into this category, that actually your life is now being used and you have been identified as, sufficiently harmless, sufficiently less well connected that you could, someone would step up and actually complain for you. And you're most likely a prop. you know, in this ginormous training machinery that's now fired up to train up all these spies. Okay, so organized stalking, if a lot of people start coming forward and they say, you know, I am being stalked by these gangs, most likely your life is being used as training. So you stop asking, yeah, but what have you done? Do you have links to terrorism or whatever? Because would you actually train up your rookies on a real life terrorist or real life organized criminal? Probably not, because they probably end up with, you know, their head cut off in bed. So this is probably not good for training. So you wouldn't put your rookies onto real criminals, even if, you know, the target of this law and security apparatus were to, you know, fight organized criminals. Let's assume that's the case. But even then, you wouldn't put your new entries onto the really tough cases because they wouldn't last a day in the job. So you would try to identify the most harmless individuals. So when people come forward and say, I'm being, you know, gang stalked, and people gang up on me and I'm seeing all these weird scenes, ask, who do you think is doing this? You know, and if it falls into this rough pattern, or they say, you know what, all these people, they look really like, you know, I mean, I don't have any class issues or anything. I'm not saying it to, you know, put people down who are poor or anything. But if people say, yeah, you know, it's a lot of just, they seem to be very poor, you know, or very just, or I actually, sometimes you talk to these stalkers and they seem very uneducated. Nothing against uneducated people, nothing against poor people, but these people will be the target, you know, for simple tasks like street stalkers, for the street surveillance system. That's what you would expect, because you'd never have a professor of biochemistry going, oh yeah, you know what, I really want to give up my job and just stalk people in the street. No. So you're looking for people who are, you know, they need the money and they don't really have the level of education to do something else. So this is how to understand the organized stalking phenomenon. You know, if you think, hang on, could it be that, because in the UK we know it for sure, right? Now for Germany I also showed you that there are tax benefits. So if you only pay 10% of tax when you become part of the system as an informant, or, you know, whatever your title might be, of course, this system's going to recruit more and more people. So it will be a runaway process in Germany too. And, you know, after several decades of these tax laws being in place, you just expect the country to be swamped by these people, you know. And I think that's what we see now. And there's also a network effect. So in the beginning, only a few people know about this tax benefit and the system slowly grows. But as it grows, it doesn't grow linearly. In the end, there's a turn-on curve, because the probability that you come across, you're networked with someone in your life who knows about this and at some point will say, hey, did you know if you become an informant, don't have to do much, like literally you just do nothing for most of the year, but you only pay 10% tax, you know. So there will also be a natural system effect, which is a non-linear turn-on curve, and that's a network effect. So networks spread information non-linearly, because, you know, when you hit certain hubs, well-connected, very chatty people, they just blast information everywhere, and there are these non-linear effects. And the more people know, the more likely you are to have heard about it. So in Germany, by this tax law alone, and sorry, I'll show you the reference again. It's right here in this book. This is the very famous textbook in Germany. If you go to, this is now the 2011 edition, but it's called the Spitzelsteuer, only 10%. This is on page 60 on the 2011-2012 edition. So if you become an informant in Germany, you only pay 10% tax. In a country with tax rates of 20 to 40%, and ka-ching, you know, but it will lead to a runaway process. That's Germany. So in Germany, I'm not surprised that the country at some point gets swamped by snitches, by gang stalkers, by informants. That's like encoded. And people who put this in probably didn't know much about mathematics and didn't expect, because this is probably old. This is probably from like at least the 1960s or 70s, you know. If it's not actually straight from the 1950s, please check the history of this tax law. But whenever they put it in, as a systems analyst, I can tell you that this will lead to a nonlinear process, because everybody will want to have it. So after a couple of decades, suddenly there will be just this explosion in snitches, you know, unless you actually, and the people in power want that. So it's very good, because then you're controllable, then you work for them, you know. So in Germany, it's not surprising that there's a gangstalking explosion because of this tax law. In the UK, not surprising, there's this gangstalking explosion because MI5 budget doubled in 2003. No fat surprise. I would guess that the budget's also probably doubled in the US, and please check for other countries where I don't know much about it, but I would expect the war on terror, or the war of terror, as I call it, is global. It affects the Western world. So I think something similar must have happened in Japan, South Korea, you know, wherever. But please, you check, you do the research for your country. But this is how to understand and not be surprised when people talk about organized stalking. And do not put them down as paranoid. You know, okay, this is so much about organized stalking.
Surveillance state.
This week, Senate Democrats held a hearing about artificial intelligence technology and ideas for regulation in this space with these fast breakthroughs and few rules. The hearing echoes many conversations about this kind of tech today. There's fears about abuse. There's a whole range of examples, from automating jobs and things that might save time to upending national security or how the police do their jobs. And we hear a lot of kind of general platitudes. Well, tonight we turn to news in one specific way that artificial intelligence technology is changing our world, and it is absolutely remarkable. Current medical technology can gather rich information about brain activity. We knew that. But now, artificial intelligence language models are providing a new breakthrough to interpret that brain information. New research shows that the tech can help read people's private thoughts, that the science plus the tech enables mind reading. Let me say that news again, because sometimes around here we just report the news, we run right through it, and you kind of need to realize what we're learning. And I'm going to show you exactly what we mean by this, but researchers are accurately performing some human mind reading. They can translate a person's brain activity into a continuous stream of text. So then that text corresponds to what the researchers can determine people are thinking. And this is from formal results from a research team at the University of Texas at Austin. Now, the new option raises all kinds of possibilities. One of the first is a medical priority, that this can enable people who are currently paralyzed or completely physically impaired to basically get a brand new lease on communicating. The researchers focused on picking up attempted speech of people who have lost the ability to speak, or using these tools to help paralyzed people, in a sense, write by thinking of writing. So the tech is using scans of brain blood flow, and it basically trains this translator or this decoder of that brain information. And they do this by having participants consume videos to map their reactions and basically the intended words their brain would pick about what they're seeing. The researchers are using the brand data to become this translator of the subject. And this has successfully used brain activity to accurately describe events from the videos, meaning it works. They're doing this. So the stuff in your brain that drives you to pick a word, that's kind of what happens before the word, can actually be now read through these sophisticated artificial intelligence language models, hence mind reading. Now, this is a dazzling, actual, applicable type of technology that's here right now. Scientists see a potential to give a voice to the voiceless, like those paralyzed individuals I just mentioned. Others look down the road, especially at how fast this is going, and they see the prospect of a powerful and invasive technology here. And let's remember, I mentioned this earlier in the show, the power of mind reading has long been a sci-fi fascination, upending society to the idea that if you could read minds, the government would have huge tools of potential control. Like that famous Tom Cruise movie, imagining a government that can solve and then prevent crimes by reading people's minds and plans in advance.
What's coming?
Double homicide, 1 male, 1 female. Killer's male, white, 40s.
Set up a perimeter and tell them we're en route. I'm placing you under arrest for the future murder of Sarah Marks.
All we have to run on are the images that they produce.
We see what they see.
There hasn't been a murder in 6 years. There's nothing wrong with the system. It is perfect. I agree.
We are arresting individuals who have broken no law.
But they will.
The fact that you prevented it from happening doesn't change the fact that it was going to happen.
That was a movie. But back here in reality, this new tech is already raising what we might call non-fiction questions. The New York Times is proposing scenarios like a future where a private, unvoiced impression of your best friend's new partner could be seized. Someone could listen in on it without your consent or knowledge. Or as with those movies, a police state where authorities could eavesdrop on your mental state without your consent, as Vox put it. When you look, Zeke, at these breakthroughs, as mentioned, great promise for people in very tough individual situations, medical breakthroughs, but great concerns out there, especially with no rules or laws yet, about what else can happen. How do you view this?
Well, I'm actually a little pessimistic about it because I think we have great intentions to have therapeutic advances and to really help people. There's no doubt that's what's motivating this research. But we have seen a lot of big tech going and being out of our control. And by our control, I don't mean just Americans' control. I mean all of humanity's control.